to say, let's box in our AIs so they'll never do the wrong thing, whatever the wrong thing might be considered to be, is both undoable and if we say, let's box them in, they never do the wrong thing, well, then they'll kind of never be able to do the right thing either. If you say, I want to constrain them so that they can only move this way and that way, well, it turns out if they only move this way and that way, they can't do the wonderful things that we'd like them to do in the end.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today, we're going to be getting a skeptical evaluation of the complex debate that's currently raging on the future of artificial intelligence, aiming to get a balanced view of the extremely useful applications versus the currently hugely publicized existential risks, and evaluate the safety measures and legislative frameworks that are being considered to help avoid risk to humans. Now, to do this, we're going to be tracing the path from today's artificial intelligence right up the ever steeper curve towards artificial superintelligence. We're going to be risk assessing the unpredictability of emergent properties of such systems, and we're going to be assessing the future of work and the potential loss of control of our culture as AI starts to outnumber us and generate more and more of the media that we consume. Now, my guest today has a unique take on these issues as he disagrees with the alarmism and the call for harsh regulation, whilst openly predicting that emergent properties will more or less guarantee safety hazards. But the fact that he's been at the cutting edge of computer science for over 40 years, creating computer language and AI solutions, makes him well placed to provide a counterpoint to the AI safety campaigners calling for collective action. He is, of course, physicist, computer scientist and tech entrepreneur Stephen Wolfram. In 1987, he left academia at Caltech and Princeton and devoted himself to his own computer systems at his company, Wolfram Research. He's published many blog articles about his ideas and written many influential books, including A New Kind of Science, a project to find the fundamental theory of physics, computer modeling and simulation of dynamic systems, and most recently, The Second Law, about the mystery of entropy. Now, I've been wanting to speak to Stephen about this since we ran out of time last year in our fascinating introduction to his computational universe work, which I highly recommend listeners if you haven't heard that already. So needless to say, I can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. So, Stephen, welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. It's great to have you on again. How are you today?
Thank you. Yes.
Now, Stephen, as we spoke just last year in a brilliant introduction to your computational universe worldview, I'd like to deviate from my usual first question about my guest's earliest deep conscious reflections and ask you this one instead. Now, you've been fascinated by computers since you first touched one at school, and they weren't so common in those days. When was the first time you thought about machine learning and the vast potential of generative AI, and what did you think about?
Well, it depends what you mean by machine learning, but I was interested in neural networks because that was in the kind of story of how one can think about the world computationally. That was kind of an early idea from the 1940s, actually. And I was aware of it probably, by when I was a kid by certainly the early 1970s, one had heard of kind of cybernetics and the term AI, I think certainly was invented in 1956, but it was something that one had vaguely heard of. And when I started using a computer, 1973, that wasn't the front and center kind of thing to think about. When I ended up getting more serious about using computers and thinking in terms of computers by the end of the 1970s, I was pretty familiar with kind of ideas about neural networks and kind of the attempts to think about artificial intelligence. I guess the first time I kind of touched a neural net with my own hands was probably 1981, when I was interested in using them. Well, okay, so it's a bit more personal history. So I had been gotten involved when I was a mid-teenager in doing physics research. And one of the sort of secret weapons that I discovered is that you could use computers to do things like mathematical calculations. And I became fairly quickly, I think, the world's largest user of the systems that had been built to do those kinds of things. So 1979, I just turned 20, and I kind of was like, okay, the tools that people have built so far don't go the distance for me. I have to build my own. So I started building my own first big computer system. That got finished in 1981. That computer system was something aimed first and foremost at doing things like mathematical computation, technical computation, and so on. But I kind of got on the roll of thinking, well, okay, I can do all that stuff automatically. What about kind of everyday thinking kinds of things? And so I got to kind of think about, well, what would it take to build sort of an AI system? I also had this idea, I've been interested since I was an early preteen, actually, in kind of how does one take the knowledge of the world and make it so that it can be sort of automatically accessed, automatically worked with, and so on. And I had, when I was a 12-year-old or something, I was doing that by typing out lots of things on a typewriter. By the time I was, by the beginning of the 1980s, I was kind of like, can we make a computer do this? And my first assumption was the only way to make a computer kind of take the knowledge of the world and automate its use was to build a brain-like thing, an AI-like thing. And so I got to thinking, how would one do that? That led me to, well, all kinds of thinking about kind of how you make computers learn things, how you make computers think like humans do, and so on. That was sort of branch number one. Branch number two, this was a more complicated question than you might have imagined. Branch number two was that I was interested in kind of the foundations of computation. And one of the sort of ideas about computation had been neural nets from 1943. And those, in the beginning of the 1980s, so happened I was at Caltech, and there was a bunch of work going on there about neural nets. And so I think I simulated my first neural net probably in 1981. I didn't manage to make it do anything interesting. In fact, I was suspicious that the results that were being claimed at the time were actually correct, because the thing that I simulated really didn't do anything interesting. But I was curious, could one analyze how it worked? I then also was interested in kind of a more of a question about the natural world, which is sort of how do you get complex things in the natural world, brains being one big example of that. And that led me to start with neural nets, try and simplify the ideas of neural nets. And I ended up with much simpler systems that are called cellular automata that I've studied a lot. And that kind of came out of, in part, it was one branch was kind of simplifying neural nets to get to that. But anyway, so my first kind of adventures with neural nets and trying to make computers learn things and so on was beginning of the 1980s. Then, in fact, the company that I started based on my first big software system, that was in 1981. At the time, there was sort of an enthusiasm for AI. That was one of the periods when AI was in an up state, particularly with expert systems and things like this. And the company that I started, originally called Computer Mathematics Corporation, but after it merged with another company, our fine investors were convinced that AI was the thing of the 1980s, and the company was actually renamed to Inference Corporation, kind of an AI company. That was 1983 or so. So I wasn't very convinced with its AI kind of directions. I mean, eventually went public in a rather undistinguished IPO many years later, but it was so that was kind of my first introduction to sort of things AI. It's sort of an interesting maybe footnote to this that many years later, I had kind of returned to this question of, can you take the knowledge of the world and make it automatically accessible, so to speak? I'd returned to that quite a few times over the years. And I kept on wondering, do you need to build a whole kind of human-like AI to do that or not? Finally, in the around 2002, I had just finished my big book, New Kind of Science. And one of the sort of scientific conclusions of that book, almost philosophical conclusions, is that there really isn't a bright line between the intelligent and the merely computational. And so that was kind of a sort of big conclusion of the science. And so I got to thinking, if that's really true, then my belief that the way to sort of automate kind of accessing the knowledge of the world requires a human-like brain, mind, can't be true. There has to be a merely computational way to do that. And so I thought, okay, given that sort of science and philosophy that I've done, how about I actually build such a thing? I had built a large technology stack in Mathematica and Wolfram language, and our whole kind of computational language stack had kind of provided the raw material, the practical raw material to make an attack like that, so to speak. But then it was around, 2005 or so, I decided, okay, time to get serious about this. The result of that was our system, Wolfram Alpha, our computational knowledge engine system that got released in 2009. So that was kind of that was my non-AI AI, so to speak. And when that came out, it was sort of interesting because AI was at an all-time low, and there were people who were in the kind of AI world who were like, nothing works in AI. I remember I was a friend of mine named Marvin Minsky, who was a well-known AI person. I saw him just a few weeks before Wolfram Alpha was released. And I said to Marvin, we have this interesting product that's going to come out in a few weeks. You should see it. This is your kind of thing. So he looks at it for a moment and he's kind of like changes the subject. I said, no, Marvin, you should actually look at this. It actually works. Types a few more things in. And he's like, oh my God, this actually works. And, we're at some event and he's running around talking to other people and say, you got to look at this. It actually works. This was but in a sense, it was Wolfram Alpha, for example, was a very non-AI AI in the sense that it was doing things that were thought to be AI-like. It's doing things, what it does is it takes natural language input and it computes answers based on that. So you ask it things, whether you're asking it things about chemistry or things about kind of the world as it is and so on, and it's computing, it knows this city and that city, and it computes the distance between them, or it computes the distance to the planet Mars right now based on knowing about celestial mechanics, things like this. But what it's doing, in a sense, is very non-human. It's was kind of a strange thing because people have been trying to do this in sort of the AI world, and they've been trying to do it by doing sort of what they thought of as human-like reasoning. And it's kind of like my view of that is that what they were doing was what people were doing, for example, in science before the time of Galileo and Newton and so on. They were doing they were thinking about the world in terms of natural philosophy. Can you reason about what will happen in the world? What we were doing was, in a sense, just completely cheating. We were using, by cheating, I mean, we were using the last 300 years of modern science to just say, okay, you want to know where the moon is going to be? Just, use celestial mechanics and compute the answer. Don't try and reason it out with as a kind of a matter of pure human thought. So that was kind of that whole approach of, compute things, use sort of precise knowledge, curated knowledge, build a framework for thinking sort of formally, symbolically, precisely about the world. That's what I've spent the last, 40 years or so working on from a technology point of view. Now, when it comes to kind of the latest sort of work that's happened in AI, it's kind of an interesting thing because there's this kind of neural net, sort of shallow but broad kind of linguistic interface that gets set up. And then there's, well, okay, when you actually want to compute something and you actually need to do that computation, how do you do that? And it so happens that the thing we built for human users over the course of the last 40 years or so is a wonderful thing for the AIs as well. And it's an interesting question whether every day right now, are there more human users of our tech or AI users of our tech? Actually, not sure.
We're going to be coming back to that, yeah. Now, I want to start with the extraordinary positives and potential applications of artificial intelligence before we get into the risks and the possible safeguards. And I'm hoping to separate the real potential from the hype, because there's a lot of hype at the moment. Starting with one of your great visions here, the use of artificial intelligence for computer modeling in science. Now, in early 2024, you published an article, Can AI Solve Science?, which listeners can also find on your website. And they can also find it on your YouTube channel if they prefer to listen to it. And in that article, you go deeply into the steady improvement of AI in accurately modeling complex systems. But you also confront the major obstruction to your important computational irreducibility principle. Computational irreducibility obstructs even an advanced intelligence from using its mathematical and computational power to jump ahead and predict the future of a complex system. Now, listeners, we do go into this in detail in last year's interview, so I'm not going to ask Stephen to go over it all again here. But briefly, can you remind us how this principle fundamentally limits even the most advanced AI system from predicting anything beyond what you call pockets of reducibility? And maybe summarize with what you concluded, if AI will, in fact, one day solve science.
Right. So, I mean, there's a question of what science is trying to do. And one of the things that one imagines kind of from the tradition of Galileo and Newton and so on in physical sciences is one of the big things you might hope for from science is figure out what's going to happen in some system before it actually happens. And that the basic framework there is, you know, the rules by which the system operates. Now you can use those rules to kind of jump ahead and see what the system's going to do a long time from now. Now, the actual process of the system doing what it does, you can think of as a computation. It's using those rules to compute what's going to happen next, and so on. And the question really is, can we, in some way, or an AI for that matter, kind of be smarter than the system itself and jump ahead and say, oh, you don't have to go through those million steps of evolution, so to speak. I can just jump ahead and say, I know what's going to happen in the end. That's what computational irreducibility is about, is the fact that there are a great many systems in which you cannot do that, in which the only way to find out what the system is going to do is basically to run the steps that the system itself has to go through and see what happens. So in other words, it's kind of computational irreducibility is a fundamental limitation to the kind of vision of science that one has, where it's just like, we know the rules, now we can jump ahead and predict everything about what's going to happen. So that's, and one of the questions then is, well, okay, we can't jump ahead and see what's going to happen with our minds, with our mathematics, but, you know, could these AIs, which seem to be doing so many amazing things and making ChatGPT and all those sorts of things, could the AIs somehow find a way to sort of magically jump ahead? And the answer is no, because this is a sort of fundamental feature of kind of the way computation works, that you can't do that. Now, in a sense, it's, and maybe we'll come back to this later, one of the things about irreducible computation is that if a computation is irreducible, you have to go through it to find out the answer. If you didn't have to go through it to find out the answer, in a sense, why would you do the computation in the first place? If you could just say, well, I can just jump ahead, it's like, well, then don't do the computation, so to speak. You can just, if you're building a computational system, for example, you could say, well, if we're always going to be able to jump ahead, why don't we just use the jump ahead system rather than the system that had to go through the actual computation? So, but the question that, one thing to understand about sort of the current round of neural net-based AI is that it's kind of working a bit like brains work. The details don't work the same way. My guess is that when you kind of, there's a great deal of sort of universality and robustness in what's possible with a system of that general type. And that, in fact, the things we can do with brains are very similar to the things you can do with artificial neural nets. And the details of, just how much training it needs and how fast this is going to run and so on, those will be different between, the glucose-consuming kind of wetware that we have in our brains and the kind of, the digital electronics that at least nominally runs 1 million times faster than the elements of our brains. So it's, but I think it's going to be quite comparable. And the fact is that if we just think about what we can easily do, we can kind of figure out what we're going to say next in human language. We can do a certain amount of simple math. We can't. Essentially, nobody can run a non-trivial program in their heads. That's just not something people do. Computers do it. They have an easy time doing that. We don't do that, nor do neural nets. And when it comes to something where there's sort of to work out what's going to happen in such and such a system requires essentially running a program in your head, it requires doing that irreducible computation, then no, the neural net is not going to be able to do that. Now, the footnote to this that's a little bit non-trivial is it could be that to work out in detail what's going to happen in some particular kind of system, you have to do all this irreducible computation and so on. But that's all just working out the details. And when it comes to what we humans care about, we just say, we don't care about any of that. We just want to know roughly, does it do this or that? And you might be able to work that out without needing to know all of those details. And to some extent, that works. There are situations where that works. And there's situations where you can get kind of an idea of what's going to happen without going into those details. I mean, back in the day when I was a kid, for example, weather forecasting in England in particular was something which, how was weather forecasting done? It was done by people who had these kind of heuristic knowledge of, oh, if there's a cyclone here and the wind is coming this way and so on, then roughly I think it's going to be this. Okay, that segued into an attempt to sort of beat the computational irreducibility of actual fluid dynamics and do things with computers, and considerable success has been achieved with that. But it's still the case that you could get a fair distance in figuring out things that were important, so to speak, about the weather by just doing those kinds of heuristic things, with people just with their minds doing that. And that's, again, something we can expect that the AIs are going to be able to do. If what you want to do is roughly say, how do you want to rank these results from a search engine? Okay, that's going to work well from an AI. If you want to say, how do I launch this rocket that's going to go exactly, past the moon in this way, it will be a mistake to kind of, use an AI to try to do that because it's not going to get it exactly right.
Mm. And Stephen, what other applications, sorry to go back to the sort of more practical side, what other applications do you see coming about in the future as this technology advances that you find particularly exciting and useful and worth developing?
I think the thing to understand is the number one thing that sort of the current round of AI is really pretty good at is being a linguistic user interface. We're used to graphical interface, you click here, click there, and so on. What modern AI enables is you just sort of vaguely talk about stuff. You're kind of, and when we talk about stuff, we're taking our thoughts and we're packaging them up so that we can communicate them. Well, it turns out that modern AIs can more or less understand those thoughts in the sense that they can sort of take those thoughts and do things with them. So, for instance, one thing that very useful in our world is you can take sort of a vague thought about something and you can turn it into, you can have the AI kind of say, well, this is a piece of precise computational language code that is what kind of implements a version of the thought you had. This is a very powerful thing because you can kind of, you can just sort of vaguely be thinking about this or that. And then the AI can kind of give you sort of, this is a nugget of precise computation that you can then say, oh, yes, I recognize that that's what I actually was thinking about, even though I hadn't kind of, crispened it up to that point. And it's an important piece of letting one go from sort of anything X to computational X. So that's the thing from a very practical point of view. That's the thing in our technological world. That's something that's really powerful, that you can go from, I have this vague idea about something to, crispen it up, make it computational, then give me this solid sort of brick that I can build with that is computational. Now, by the time it's that solid brick, it has little to do with the linguistic user interface. That's then you get to take that brick and build on it and so on. So that's one example of a use case. Another example of a use case that, I mean, there are many use cases, but the important heuristic about use cases is if what you're trying to do is get things sort of 80, 90% right, then that's a good potential use case for machine learning, AI, neural nets, etc. If you've got something where it really matters that you get it 100% right, and you're going to build and build and build on top of the thing that you set up, then machine learning, AI, neural nets are probably not a good bet. So, if, for example of, let's say, a search engine, if you say, well, I want to surface 10 results, and I'm going to look at them myself. And if 2 of them are really what I want, I'm a happy person. The fact that there may be 3 others that were totally crazy is irrelevant to me. So that's a good use case. The case where you're saying, I'm going to make this piece of code, I'm going to just have the machine automatically make it, and I'm going to rely on it, and I'm going to build and build and build on top of it. And oh, whoops, if there was something slightly wrong with it, my whole tower is going to topple over. That's not a good use case. Now, when it comes to interfacing, I mean, there's so many things. I mean, an example, simple example. It's, there are lots of papers that come out about AI. For the last couple of years, at our company, we get this AI-generated summary every day. And it's actually better than trying to read the original papers. It's kind of writes in this rather boring, mundane way, but that's very easy to process. You don't have to adapt to the individual writing style of this or that author and so on. So that's an example of a good use case. Now, could it get something wrong? Sure, it could. Could I fail to read something? Yes, I will fail to read something much of the time. So it's kind of one of these things where if it's getting it 80% right, it's getting way ahead, so to speak. I think similarly in something I'm kind of interested in science right now. I'm trying to understand some things to do with applications of our physics project and so on, and it kind of requires me to know what's in hundreds of thousands of papers, academic papers. Okay, and back even in the 1970s, I started using systems that could search online databases of abstracts of papers. So I could say, get me a paper that matches these keywords and so on. Later on, the web made that much easier, but that was already possible in the 1970s. But if you want to do that thematically, if you want to say, hey, wait a minute, like a good example, I mean, and it's very close to what I'm actually trying to do, is back in the 1800s, people wondered, do molecules exist? Is matter discrete? And they didn't know, and there were all kinds of, experiments people would make up to try and figure that out. Turns out there was an effect, Brownian motion, been discovered in the 1830s by a botanist. And that effect, if one had sort of recognized it in the right way, would have told one the answer. But that wasn't recognized until around 1900. But so the thematic question of, is there anything out there that would tell us, some experiment somebody did in botany, for example, that could give us a clue about this kind of scientific result? That's something that is sort of a thematic search. And it's something that I suspect haven't really, it hasn't yet matured for me, but I suspect is a pretty good use case of kind of doing something where the AI has this ability to kind of thematically, ingest much larger volumes of information than I'm able to do. I mean, there are many of these use cases. I mean, other use cases are things like, I don't know, one, well, there are things, very practical things like, you have to file some document that says, some regulatory compliance thing. And it's kind of like, you've got to write, 50 pages of stuff that explains why this or that thing is true or not, or whatever it is. Well, have an AI do that. It's probably going to be read by an AI on the other side. And now, is that a ridiculous situation? I don't think it's as ridiculous as one might imagine, because essentially what's happening is I'm going to go from the 5 things that are really important that I need to say, but then I've got to interface that with the system on the other side that's going to care about 4 other things that are sort of somewhat similar, but not necessarily quite aligned. How do we interface those things? Well, an answer is we take the 5 points I had, we fluff it up into a big, long chunk of English, for example. Then the AI on the other side takes that, and it's this linguistic user interface idea that the English becomes the interface medium for communicating the points I wanted to make and sort of translating them into the points that the folks were trying to understand on the other side. So that's another kind of use case. I mean, there are many
great examples. Thank you, Stephen. Now, moving on, the current race towards artificial general intelligence, which is developing out of the artificial narrow intelligence we've had up until now, has recently and finally got the attention of lawmakers and the general public after years of warning bells from the AI safety specialists. And the alarm has really captured the imagination of the public, particularly now because of the unexpected advances of these large language models you've just been talking about, and particularly ChatGPT. But before we get onto the oddities of ChatGPT, I want to take a moment just to define some terms and scales here for the listeners, so we can actually visualize this rather than, because it's quite counterintuitive how exponential the curve that we're creeping up is on this road to artificial superintelligence. And this artificial superintelligence is, of course, the one that could be an existential risk to humans. So, Stephen, could you just take a brief moment for the listeners to explain to us the difference between ANI, A.G.I, and ASI, and from there just try to explain why the curve beyond A.G.I gets so steep that it's impossible even for specialists to predict the timescales required to arrive to ASI?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm a big believer in some of these kind of acronym-based
well, that's
ideas.
very much why I've invited you, Stephen, because I knew you'd tell us how it was without any hype.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to understand is it's a very muddled concept. I mean, these are very muddled concepts. There's, from the earliest days of AI, people have said, well, let's make a thing that does in a computer something like what human minds do. And what does one mean by that? Well, people had said, well, if you can do this, you can do that. Alan Turing had this test of, can you have a conversation where you can't tell if you're talking to a computer or to a human? As soon as Wolfram Alpha came out, people built kind of chatbots where you couldn't tell, you could tell you weren't talking to a human, and the way you could tell was it knew far too much, which was exactly the opposite of what you might have expected. But I think this question of, well, what is it about sort of human minds that is fundamentally different from the things that we see in computational systems? Well, people have been hoping that there is such a thing, forever, because we feel very proud of the fact that we humans are special and so on. But it's not clear there is any such thing. Just like we thought that our planet was, we were the center of the universe. Turns out we're not. Turns out when it comes to, we thought that when it comes to creating human language, for example, we were the only things you could imagine that would do that. Turns out we're not. And there's sort of been a continual, well, is there somewhere we turn over that rock, there'll be this magic thing underneath that only humans can do, and it takes us a lot of effort to get the machines to do it. But in the end, you start saying, well, how similar is the machine to a human? Well, it's similar in lots of ways, but there are other ways in which it's different. I mean, we humans are biological organisms that live finite lives. We have certain experiences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the end, the only thing that is just like a human is a human. And as soon as you abstract from being sort of exactly a human and you say, well, it's a human, but it's actually a box on my desk, well, then it's not actually a human, because you can start sort of poking at it, and there'll be places in which it's definitely not like a human.
So the idea of A.G.I would be that in some sense, the AI could learn almost anything in a way that a narrow AI that's only trained on a certain data set could. That's the main difference, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what would you like to learn? I mean, in other words, you want to learn how to, pick something up, you want to learn how to have a discussion like this. These are things where some level of learning that is either possible now or very much within range. And you might say, well, okay, does that mean we humans can just hang everything up and say we're done? Let's let the AIs take over from here. I was reading some things recently written in the early 1960s, and people were at that point saying, you know what's going to happen? We are just, evolution, biological evolution has been going for 3 billion years. We're another step. The next thing we're going to evolve into is the AIs. We should just we should just expect that we're just a link in the chain and the AIs are going to take over from here. It is amusing to read things that were written in the early 1960s along those lines, because if you take the individual sentences with a few kind of nods of failures of political correctness and so on, you couldn't tell whether those sentences were written in 1962 or in 2025.
There's a lot of hype, isn't there? But let's help the listeners imagine that curve of just how fast, once we get beyond a certain level of development, how fast that curve will become ridiculously steep, and these systems will become incredibly powerful.
No, you have to understand what's an AI right now. If you say what's going on inside that AI, we don't understand it. I mean, I've made some progress in having a picture of sort of what is foundationally happening in machine learning and why does it work. I understand something about that now from a scientific point of view. And it's a little bit of a story of computational irreducibility and a story of you can't know what's going to happen in detail, you just have to run it and so on. But the fact is, it's, we look at these things and what's happening inside is complicated and not really accessible or understandable to us. Now, we might say, okay, then they've run away from us. They're doing things we don't understand. Yes, they are doing things we don't understand. And that's, what is the consequence of that? Where are they going to go doing things we don't understand? Well, if you just say, okay, just do an arbitrary computation, just do the computation some computation you pick at random, just do a computation you quotes feel like, well, it's going to go off and do something. It's going to do something that is incomprehensible to us. This is, in my own scientific work, I've spent lots of time kind of jumping out into the computational universe and seeing what's there. And most of what's there is, at the beginning at least, incomprehensible to us. It's just some computational thing that's happening. So you might say, well, that's, so the AIs have run away from us and this is a terrible situation. Worth remembering, we already have a great example of something just like this that we're extremely familiar with, which is the natural world. Things that happen in the natural world, we don't intrinsically understand. They just do what they do. Sometimes what they do is very powerful. Sometimes it's very useful to us. Sometimes it's very bad for us. But there's a lot going on that we don't in detail understand. We've used science to try and get some understanding of what's happening, to try and sort of make a bridge between the things that go on in the natural world and things that we can understand in our minds. And, what's happening with AI is what happens inside the neural net, what happens inside the computational system is a process a bit like what happens in the natural world. And there's this issue of, well, is it doing what we want it to do? It's kind of like in the natural world, did we manage to take that natural process and sort of turn it into something that's technologically useful to us? Does it, do we manage to direct it, or does the tornado just do what the tornado does and we don't have a way to harness it or to control it? And I think that's sort of the picture. Now, in when it comes to the question of sort of will the AIs be doing things we don't understand? Yes, they already are. And is that something if we choose to attach that to things in our world, then lots of stuff will happen just like it does with nature that we don't understand. I think it's worth understanding that the role of humans in all of this is, yes, you can automate many things. Yes, there are many things the AIs will just intrinsically do. Our role is to decide what is the thing you want to do. In other words, we can, people like me have spent lots and lots of effort trying to make it as automatic as possible to do things with computers, get computers to do those things and so on. But the computer on its own just sits there. It could be set up to just sort of pick programs at random, but more or less, the computer doesn't have an intrinsic way to know what to do. It's us.
And what exactly are people referring to then when they talk about artificial superintelligence? Are they talking about a very large number of networked AIs? What is it that the idea of superintelligence that makes it so attractive? What would be the applications of creating a network like that?
Well, I'm not sure what they're talking about. I ask them occasionally, and usually I think let me give you an example of something I consider sort of an interesting direction along these lines. I don't really understand the end result of. So if we humans, sort of one of our prouder achievements is human language, being able to take our thoughts, package them up into language and communicate them. We do a lot better than cats and dogs, for example, do. Cats and dogs, maybe there's, sit, fetch, whatever. We can do one word at a time, but they don't get to express themselves in sort of the flowing compositional language that we humans have. Well, we have more neurons in our brains than they do. And there's sort of a question, if we had 100 times the number of neurons in our brains, what kind of a thing would we invent that is beyond the compositional language that we have today, that's our way of packaging up thoughts? Okay? I don't know the answer. I've been thinking about that question. But one of the things that you realize as you think about that question is, yes, there may be something that you could imagine beyond that, but it is rather inaccessible to us humans. It is probably as inaccessible as the details of poetry is to a cat. And, what does that mean? Well, there are plenty of phenomena in the natural world that are inaccessible to us. There are plenty of phenomena in the natural world that do very complicated things and so on. We can make a few scientific statements about them, but fundamentally, the details of, how the water in the waterfall is flowing and so on, that's not something at the level of what we can appreciate with our human brains. So in a sense, if the customer is a human, so to speak, there can be very elaborate things that are happening, but it may just not matter. It may be something where, yes, in the civilization of the AIs, there's all this amazing stuff and it's super intelligent and it's doing all these things. But the human who's looking at it is just like, well, looks like it drew a picture of an elephant. Now, to the internal to the AI, it might be, if you could imagine what that thought process was like, if you could package up that thought process in a way that was accessible to humans, it might be that as it drew that picture of an elephant, it was thinking these amazing thoughts and having all of these kind of, all these things but we don't understand that. And not only do we not understand it, we don't care about it. Just like the details of sort of the motion of the water in the waterfall is probably something, unless we happen to be studying hydrodynamics, et cetera, it's not something that is significant to us. So insofar as we're the customer, what appears to be going on is, there's a certain set of things that appear to be going on, and that's maybe different from what's sort of, in some sense, happening inside. And I think that when you look at something and you say, I have no idea why that computer program did that particular thing. I have no idea why this very trivial rule did this thing. That's an interesting experience, and it's something that reveals the fact that there is more than the things that human minds do on their own. I mean, an experience I've had, so I've spent a lot of effort studying simple programs and what they do. And the remarkable fact that I discovered back in the early 80s is that even incredibly tiny, programs you can specify in one line and so on, can do amazingly complicated things, where you could spend a lifetime studying the details of what that program does. So the thing that, it happens to me all the time is I think I understand. I think I've set up some little kind of program. I'm pretty sure I know what it's going to do. And the reason that I set it up is because I had some guess about what it was going to do. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have even set it up. But then I actually run it. And the thing that is continually shocking and humbling is that these programs always do things I didn't expect. I mean, my sort of line for this, particularly people who work with I end up saying so often, the computational animals are always smarter than we are. And you might think after one's been doing this for 45 years that one would have gotten to the point where no, one could see what's going to happen. But I have to say, every week I'll do something and I'll do some computer experiment and something will happen that I absolutely didn't expect. And this is kind of the sign both of this computational irreducibility phenomenon, but in some sense, it's kind of a little tentacle of, you could think of it as a little tentacle of superintelligence, poking in and, knocking and saying, by the way, there's more in the computational universe than those human minds of yours can grasp and deal with.
And that's exactly where I want to come back to when we talk about the emergent properties and the complete inability to predict what can happen. So thanks for that backdrop and that summary of all these, hugely beneficial applications and the fact that, maybe it is much more of just a sort of practical tool than all this hype is giving us. But I want to just zoom in on the near future for a moment to get our heads around what all the concern is about in the last few years and in the news, so we can really understand it. Now, firstly, can you give us some examples of the behavior of ChatGPT where it was making strong inferences well beyond its programming that caused many AI developers to announce that the A.G.I was around the corner? Can you give us a few examples, Tim?
I mean, everybody was surprised that you can make sort of fluent human language that kind of maintains sensibleness over, the course of an essay, so to speak. That wasn't expected. It was now, why did, and for example, things like that you can do logic, that, but now, so how did it get to be able to do those things? Well, essentially, ChatGPT was trained to be able to try and continue text in a way that was typical of the way that humans would write that text. So if it was, the cat sat on the, most likely the next word is Matt. But then, what was surprising was if you asked, well, what are the next 300 words? It would come up with something fairly sensible. Okay, it wasn't obvious that would happen. Now, why does that happen? Why does that work? What does it tell us? Is it magic? Is it? I don't think it's magic. I think it's actually something that we should be a little bit embarrassed that we didn't know scientifically beforehand, which is we're pretty familiar with the fact that, English sentences typically go, noun, verb, now. What we're not so clear about is, well, there are many noun, verb, noun sentences that are just complete nonsense because, those nouns and verbs just don't fit together in a way that makes meaningful sense. But the fact is, not only is there a kind of syntactic grammar of English of what parts of speech fit together, there's a semantic grammar of English that says, this word goes together with this word because then it will mean something. And ChatGPT learnt that. And we could have classified that. Aristotle even got pretty close to classifying that, but kind of stopped before he got to it. And that was a couple of thousand years ago. And people, well, they almost got back to it in the 1600s, but then didn't really. And it just hasn't been a central kind of concern in more recent times. And it's just something where ChatGPT kind of played scientist and said, more or less, this is something where there's a lot of regularity in English that, or in human language that we didn't know. When it comes to things like logic, it's like, how did ChatGPT learn logic? It was trained from a trillion words of what people have written, but that doesn't have, and it obviously had read logic textbooks, but that's not how it learned logic. The way it learned logic was the same way I think that Aristotle learned logic, which is you just look at a bunch of sentences and the typical sentence is set up to make logical sense. all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, that pattern repeats over and over and over again in the things that humans write. And so just like, Aristotle said, well, yes, there's a pattern. I can make it into a syllogism. It is a logical pattern. So ChatGPT did the same thing. And it's something where, this is a thing, maybe people are, this is always a thing where one has to develop some intuition about how things work based on sort of experience and experiments one does and so on. And none of that, it was surprising to me that it just, initially that it could produce fluent language, not what I expected to happen, not what seemed to be happening based on the kind of a curve of development of those kinds of sequence prediction systems and so on. But once you see it, it's not so difficult to understand kind of roughly what's going on. Now,
but it is an emergent property. And I just want to bear that in mind as we move forward into the safety debate. I want to introduce that safety debate by talking about the Future of Life Institute's 2023 open letter. Now, the Future of Life Institute is one of the many academic existential risk think tanks around the world, this one coming out of MIT. And this letter called for a temporary halt to the big tech companies' race towards artificial general intelligence while we got the legislation straight and decided what we actually wanted to do, very similar to what you just said, what you actually want it to do and what we want to actually keep for ourselves. So here's a quote from that letter that for me encapsulates the main problems that I want to talk to you about, Stephen. Should we let machines flood our information channels with propaganda and untruth? Should we automate away all the jobs, including the fulfilling ones? Should we develop non-human minds that might eventually outnumber, outsmart, obsolete, and replace us? Should we risk loss of control of our civilization? Such decisions must not be delegated to unelected tech leaders. So just taking those briefly one by one. Firstly, the propaganda and untruth question. Regarding ethical concerns with algorithmic bias, the broken internet business model, which prioritizes maximizing engagement for advertising over the quality and content of the media being promoted by the algorithm. Now, we're going to be doing a devoted show on this, listeners. So, please, Stephen, don't feel free to comment on this particular point if you have a personal reflection about it. Is there anything you want to mention on that? I know it's not really your area.
Oh, I've been involved a bit in that. I mean, I find it very amusing when people say, let's only have the AI say things that are true. And, what exactly do we mean by this? It's, I think the thing to understand about kind of, if you want to sort of constrain your AI to only do the right thing, that shines a spotlight on what on earth do you mean by the right thing? And I think there has been there does tend to be a certain degree of abject philosophical naivete in thinking about, well, let's just have it do the right thing. Let's just have it speak only the truth. Let's have it say, this is the thing to understand is when people say, it quickly devolves. Okay, so how do you make AIs do only the right thing? What is the right thing? People will say, well, let's just have them do what the humans do. And people say, that's not a very good idea. Humans do all kinds of crazy stuff. So what do you want them to do? You want them to do things that humans aspire to do. How do you know what humans aspire to do? You can go look at, the religious texts, the self-help books, other kinds of aspirational material. But there isn't just one answer to what do humans aspire to do. There are lots of different answers. Even for a given person, there might be different answers at different times. So, you can say, let's say, you can go to the store and buy an AI that has this kind of aspiration or that kind of aspiration. It's not realistic to say, and it's a terrible mistake, by the way, to imagine that there will be a world AI aspiration, sort of charter that defines for the whole world. Let's hope that doesn't happen, because that is one way in which things could go very, very badly wrong. I mean,
Well,
it has been, it's,
it would certainly clip its wings too much, I think. Now, Stephen,
well,
let's move on because
more to the point, it's like, let's be glad that there isn't just one country in the world. You know, if it turned out that, you know, people said, this is a really good idea, let's go back to some time in history. This particular thing we're doing right now is a really good idea. Let's standardize on that for the rest of history. That turns out that doesn't really work very well. And it's even from a purely sort of theoretical point of view, from my sort of favorite phenomenon of computational irreducibility. If you imagine you have some system of laws, for example, and you're going to lock those down for the future of the world, and then you say, and we've figured out these laws, we've thought about these laws really, really hard. We know these laws are right. Okay, then run them and see what happens. Turns out there will always be unexpected consequences. That's not just a feature of, oh, you were, you know, when you thought of the laws, you weren't quite smart enough. It is inevitable. There's sort of an infinite kind of computational process where the, you know, things will happen that you didn't expect. So if you said, well, we picked, you know, the set of laws, the set of aspirations for the world, and it's this one, and we picked it in 2025, you know, it's this is not going to end well, so to speak. And I think in I mean, you personally, I think the thing you read out is I mean, first point is it is humorously similar to things that people wrote in the early 1960s. And I think people don't realize that these are not new questions, concerns, and so on. I think people, and I think the notion.
We're going to be looking at them one by one. So on to the next one, Stephen. Should we automate away all the jobs, even the fulfilling ones? Now, obviously, this is the famous AI and the future of work discussion that, again, we're going to be doing a whole episode on. But I want to get your opinion on this anyway, Stephen. As Anthony Goldblum, CEO of Kaggle, put in his TED talk on whether AI will take all of these jobs, he said, machines can excel at frequent high-volume tasks, while humans can tackle novel situations. So he thinks that there's only a limited amount of jobs that AI could ever take from humans. But personally, I feel he's not accounting for the exponential improvement beyond A.G.I. in the future that will quickly render AI flexible and good at tackling novel situations too. What do you think, Stephen? Are those flexible, novel situation jobs safe, as Goldblum suggests?
I think that, you know, I was studying this question, was curious, and so I looked at kind of all the inventory of jobs, for example, in the US from 1850 to today. And what you see is, you know, in 1850, half the country was doing agriculture. What you see in the development of economies typically is things start with a small number of activities, and then those activities get automated in some way. And what then happens is the economy gets more and more fragmented. There are more and more niches that essentially are enabled by that automation. I mean, who could have imagined that there was, you know, esports or something would be a thing, that you could make a living doing that? It's you know, today will soon be AI psychologists. There'll be people who make a living being AI psychologists. You know, some science fiction authors had imagined that even back in the 50s and so on. But you know, as a serious thing, that wasn't imagined until very recently. My feeling is that, and what you see for the lesson of history is there are big chunks that become, in a sense, routine, and they get automated. And then the question is, that then opens up many possibilities. Now, the question is, you've got to pick which of those possibilities. There's a lot of jobs that are associated with, well, then you pick what you want to do. You know, you pick, do you want to paint this picture or that picture type thing? Even though once you've started, oh, I don't know, you know, let's say, do you want to take this photograph or that photograph? Once you've clicked the shutter, the rest is automated, so to speak. It's but I think what will happen, and what we've seen happening in the past, is automation enables new possibilities. Those new possibilities get to this place where it's really a question of choice. And that question of choice, you can say, well, let's automate the choice. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because that's up for the humans to decide. They like this kind of picture, not that kind of picture. An AI can say, well, in the past, humans have always liked this or that. But there's, and so I think it's the idea that there's kind of a coming moment. And by the way, this is again a very old discussion of a coming moment of when the humans will be irrelevant. I think that I just don't see that as a realistic thing. I think I have to say, back a few years ago, people were all saying, oh, everybody's going to, it's a bunch of machine learning people were saying, beware, there are all these jobs going to be automated away and so on. And I was just very amused because I knew from things we'd done that one of the first jobs to get automated away would be the job of being a machine learning engineer.
Yeah.
Because we knew that we could machine learn how to do a lot of things that machine learning engineers do. So it's
well, on that exact note, a 2013 Oxford University study on this very topic put the figure at 50% of jobs will be lost to AI automation. If you had to just throw out a figure, no one will hold you to it, Stephen, where would you put it?
No. If you'd said that was a 2023 study, I would have guessed that it was done by ChatGPT. It's that level of I mean, just look at I don't know whether, I have to say, when I did this study of what has happened to jobs over the last 150 years, talking to friends of mine who work at business schools and things like that, they were sort of, they hadn't really done similar studies. It's surprisingly, it's a little tricky to do. And maybe I didn't get it exactly right, but I think the main arc of it is right. And yes, 1850, half the country in the US did agriculture. Today, some fraction of a percent probably does agriculture. This is the way this works. That which gets, there are jobs that are particularly particularly when things get big. So for example, today, there's a big segment, which is, for example, construction, okay? And the question of when will that get automated is an interesting question. And it might happen quite suddenly, because when there are humanoid robots that really work well, there'll be a lot of those kinds of jobs that can be automated. I think the thing that surprised people in the ChatGPT moment was that there were kind of white collar, just write a big report on something kinds of jobs that nobody expected would be kind of at risk. But actually, what it kind of tells you is those jobs are more mundane than you expected. And, I think that, I think the thing, what you have to think about is, what's the rate of new job production, new job categories? I know in my own business, I'm always amused when I have to make up a new name for a kind of job, right? So like back in 15 years ago, linguistic curator was a job title that hadn't existed before. For a brief while, prompt engineer was a job title that hadn't existed. These are, there's a rate of new categories being created. There's a rate of old categories where it's like, we don't need as many people to be filing clerks. We don't need people to do, to be human calculators and so on. So I think it's sort of a mistake to say, how many jobs will go extinct. I mean, if you go back to 1850, as I did in the study that I did, there are all kinds of job categories. Like, what's a chain man? A chain man is a job I hadn't even heard of. I had to go look it up. It's somebody who works with a surveyor, dealing with the chains that get laid out to, I think at least, if I remember correctly. But
surely there are market forces here as well that are just so powerful, as there have been, as you say, from the long history of automation, from the primitive plow in agriculture onwards, that we really don't actually have any choice about keeping fulfilling jobs for humans, because it's the businesses themselves that will decide if they want to automate it out to save money, surely.
Well, I mean, we all have our own prejudices, but I find it fulfilling to actually use my mind to figure out things that haven't been figured out before. I have been lucky enough to, lead a life where I've been able to sort of get away with doing that much of the time. And that's partly because I don't grow my own food. I don't, there are lots of things in my world that have been, and I personally have put lots of effort into automating my personal environment. and probably one of the more extreme and nerdy automators of my environment, so to speak, so that I myself can get to do things that I find sort of interesting and fulfilling. I mean, my own prejudice would be that sort of automating away, lots of things that I think are kind of mundane will allow people to spend more time doing the kinds of things I like to do. But it's worth remembering that there are plenty of things that I find mundane that other people find really exciting, and there are things I do that other people would find excruciating, that but that I find quite fulfilling. So I think I'm really not, I have to say, I think.
Just to clarify, Stephen, are you saying then that, in your opinion, it's not that jobs will be lost to automation, it's that people will find different jobs to do, like businesses will find different ways to employ people?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think that the that has been the lesson of history, and I see in my own business, for example, I can absolutely see that. I mean, in the last 38 years, the way I've operated my company is automate as much as possible, use as few humans as possible, use talented humans to do the things that are things that we haven't automated, and things that require kind of human choice and so on. And we've managed to automate a huge amount. That and I can plainly see there are functions where, yes, if I look back 30 years, there were tens of people doing that, and now there are 0 people doing it. It's completely automated. But the people, even sometimes, because we've had a lot of long-term employees, I can say, what do those actual employees do? Well, they do different things. They do things that maybe are evolutions of what they did before, but the particular things they did before, they got automated away. And, I don't think anybody, it's not, if the skill you happen to have happens to be some incredibly specific skill that happens to be incredibly automatable, then, that's a problem. It's, we all live at a certain time in history. And, if you wanted to be the person who discovered the source of the Nile, well, you're too late. And similarly, if you're the person who has, I tend to think, I tend to be quite an optimist about this as just somebody who's watched the kind of trajectories of a great many people, so to speak. It, with a little bit of imagination, the thing that was the thing that somebody really wanted to do ends up having a niche in the world as the world is. And it might not be the niche you originally imagined, but it's a niche which, sort of scratches that itch in a very effective way.
Well, Stephen, on to the last point here. Should we develop non-human minds that might eventually outnumber, outsmart, obsolete, and replace us? Now, we've covered the outsmart, obsolete, and replace point, but I want to pull out this outnumber point because I find it particularly fascinating. As you keep mentioning, quite often it's actually going to be other AIs that are receiving the information that's being generated by AIs. We're just going to steadily change the quantities of human to AI quite radically. I heard an interesting prediction that in 10 years' time, more than half of the content on the internet will be AI generated, and we won't be able to tell the difference. And that's just going to further continue the deep and strongly modifying influence on our culture that has already started with the algorithmic bias that we spoke about before.
Well,
Add to that the fact that they will outnumber us radically, and the fact that they can network through the internet to form collaborative nets of horizontally integrated information and processing power. So inevitably, we will lose control of our culture, won't we, through sheer force of numbers, as the letter predicts?
I think there are probably more computers than humans right now, a big factor. And for sure, it's easier to make a new machine than it is to make a new human, at least for now. I think this question of sort of AIs generating content that gets consumed by humans, one of the questions is, will the humans want to be like AIs? This is something you already see is people, I find it, I get email And it's like, was this written by an LLM? Was this written by an AI? Well, the shocking thing is that humans are starting to write more like AIs, as well as AIs trying to learn how to write more like humans.
It's a
And it's,
feedback loop. It's a feedback
right.
loop. And as the outnumbering goes more towards the AI level, surely we're going to, have a runaway train of cultural influence. And I guess my question is that what we want?
Well, I think that the reversion of culture to the mean of, it's all, the AI is kind of taking an average in some sense. And, insofar as then the AI becomes the authority, so to speak, and everything goes to the mean, well, that's an unfortunate situation. It's a situation that we're already pretty familiar with from human society, because when things get big, there is a tendency often for things to sort of revert to the mean. When some field of science is just a few people, lots of wild things get done. When the field of science becomes 100,000 people or 500,000 people, it's like, well, there are norms and everybody follows those norms, and the kind of the spiky, innovative stuff becomes more difficult to achieve. And I think, the vision of the future in which everything is banal and AI generated, that's an unfortunate situation. And that's a situation which, in a sense, there are forces that sort of primarily, I would say, of maybe of human laziness or something, that say, I don't want to bother. I'll just have my AI do it. But I don't know really how that plays out, because the fact is, back in the day, if you wanted to go from here to there, you would get a map and you would, you would figure out where you're going to drive, and you would figure out, oh, I think I'm going to take this road rather than that road. For years now, most people, well, certainly myself, just follow the GPS. Whatever it says is what I do.
Mm.
And I have no idea whether what it's doing is creative and, a great solution to figuring out the best route. It probably is doing actually better than I would do in that particular case. We've been involved with a bunch of algorithms for that and so on. But it's this question of when people, when people say, I'm going to abdicate in favor of my AI, that's yes, that is, if you want to be a human first kind of, if you want to lead a human first life, don't abdicate in favor of your AI, so to speak. I mean,
and that it will in the end be a question of critical thinking and personal choice, and we'll just have to hope that enough people take that seriously. Now,
I think it's worth remembering something about the arc of history that's worth remembering is, if you look at what people thought was important 1,000 years ago, it's different from what people think is important today. And, if you imagine some of the things we do today would look deeply pointless to somebody from a different age. And it's an interesting question whether, or if you are a person who grew up in a certain time in history, and history and the world is changing, it could be the case that you say, oh my gosh, the world is going in a direction that's absolutely meaningless for me. I hate it. And, I think that it has seemed to be the case that we find ways to be meaningful, so to speak, sort of across a vast swath of history, across a vast swath of different circumstances. So, for me, it's like, it sounds like a really bad outcome. I think you can imagine sort of the uploaded human consciousnesses sort of merging with AIs. And what are they doing? They're playing video games for the rest of eternity. That seems to me like a really bad outcome. To the disembodied soul that's in that environment, it's not so obvious it's a bad outcome. So it's a complicated thing to it's sort of this question. It's like this ethical grounding question of what what really should the ethics be? What should the point be? What and I know what I think the point should be. A certain mass of humanity seems to more or less agree on what the aspirations are, and that's a thing. And I have lots of personal beliefs about the importance of sort of individual choice, individual achievement, individual thinking, and so on. And I would say I'd love to see that be sort of the thing that is the dominant force, so to speak. But I think it's
rooted in our cultural context of today, and therefore it's we can't possibly project those values onto our future generations, assuming that it's the right thing to do. Now, Stephen, I have to push us on to the safety question because I really want to get your ideas on this before we close. So let's get back into the nuts and bolts of the safety problems that we really do need to get right to benefit safely from the good stuff. And the best way to frame this issue for me, for non-specialists, is to talk about the alignment problem. So the problem of ensuring that alignment of AI's objectives is in line with human objectives. Now, you've mentioned before that AI doesn't have any skin in the game, as you mentioned earlier. John Vervaeke here on the show said it doesn't care. And this, as you mentioned, is namely because it doesn't have a finite biological existence and therefore doesn't have that natural survival instinct. But I wanted to ask you about an idea that's been popularized by another of those fantastic stories from the 1950s and 60s, Isaac Asimov's famous I, Robot story, that with a sufficiently complex computational processing power and a sufficiently large number of systems multiple systems in that world, complexity theory would surely easily predict for a divergent emergent property in any one of those millions of AIs, similar to a mutation in the natural world. For example, it could develop something similar to feelings or subjective reflections or an aggressive survival instinct of many millions of other possible things that could emerge. They are, after all, part of the natural world and therefore subject to these random emergent phenomena. Doesn't your computational irreducibility principle more or less guarantee that eventually such a random outcome would occur?
Sure. Just like nature produces hurricanes and tornadoes and things. Yes. I mean, so what?
So how do we protect from that as we develop AI systems? That's the big safety question.
How do you protect from tornadoes? You try and predict them. You have tornado warning systems. You get out of town if one's coming. I mean, I think it's something where to say let's box in our AIs so they'll never do the wrong thing, whatever the wrong thing might be considered to be, is both undoable and if we say let's box them in so they never do the wrong thing, well, then they'll kind of never be able to do the right thing either. If you say, I want to constrain them so that they can only move this way and that way, well, it turns out if they only move this way and that way, they can't do the wonderful things that we'd like them to do in the end. So I think it's a lot of, I mean, I'm not quite sure what the, I mean, there's much to, there are these questions about how do you connect, what do you let an AI do? And I remember a couple of years ago now, the first moment when I had the opportunity to have an LLM control my computer. And we'd set up the software technology to make that possible. And I'm like, do I really want to do this? This is probably a mistake. I don't want it to have uncontrolled access to my computer. I want to put it in some kind of box where the actuation, where what it can do, it can't delete my files. It can't send email to people on my behalf. It can't do this and that and the other. Well, now I might want it to send email on my behalf because it would save me a bunch of time. And so I might say, well, actually, okay, let me let it send email on my behalf. Let me let it delete some files on my behalf. But I think, this question of what, can you constrain what the AI is able to do? You say, oh, don't let it be able to act as an autonomous weapon, let's say. Let's not let it be able to do this and that and the other. Well, it's very hard to come up with, I think it's pretty much impossible. If you want it to be useful, you have to give it these kinds of powers. And it's, and then And then the question is, can we coexist with it, just as we coexist with nature? And, you know, it's good not to do stupid stuff where you say, you know, put the AI, you know, I see some of these things where people said, I just have an AI doing this. And I'm like, that's not going to end well.
Right. But what's your solution, Stephen? Because if I understand correctly, you've got a couple of ideas on the table. One, a kind of sort of large network of AIs collectively policing each other in a kind of transparent blockchain approach. I mean, what else have you got on the table that can
Well,
allow us to take these risks of potentiating, of empowering AI? I mean, obviously the big fear here is military AI, drone swarm kind of technology. How can we take that risk of allowing such a useful development if we can't control it?
so I think, you know, first of all, there isn't a lot of choice, but second of all, it's the, you know,
You
so,
sound so laid back about this lack of choice here, because
well,
I
because,
agree with you. There's no choice because they will develop this behind closed doors, whether or not we come to any international
right,
agreement on it.
I think that, you know, this is an important moment for political philosophy, just as it was 400 years ago when modern democracy got kind of developed. You know, there are new questions. We don't really have great answers. It will be nice, you know, I've spent some amount of effort thinking about these things. Rather few people seem to think about these things in other than, I would say, rather knee-jerk kinds of ways. You know, I think it is an important moment. I mean, there's going to be sort of these questions. So let me give you an example. You said AIs have no skin in the game. Okay. Well, you know, let's unpack that a bit. You know, let's imagine you have a whole collection of AIs and they're all interacting with each other and they're all kind of relying on each other for this or that thing. And one of those AIs goes totally crazy. And then, so, and the other AIs in a human setting, it would be let's lock that AI up, or, you know, let's kill that AI, or whatever it is, right? And you say, well, you know, it's now the fact is what in to human society, what matters is that the human who went crazy, the human who whatever, was removed from human society. Whether that human had internal feelings of, oh, I'm unhappy to be removed from human society, is not really relevant to human society at large. What's relevant is that that human was removed from human society and society can go on. Well, the same thing can happen for AIs. That is, that an AI, you know, the network of AIs can remove another AI from that network. Now, whether you would deduce that that AI would feel sad about the fact that it was removed from that network, who's to know? And perhaps who's to care? It's a question of, and if you say, is that AI, will it evolve to the point where it will try to behave in such a way as to not be removed from the network? It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that it will, just as humans, you know, so there's a bit more to unpack. I mean, just the statement, it's a bag of bits, and if you switch it off, it's not going to notice type thing. Well, you know, I don't think, you know, from an outside point of view, we see another human who is in distress or whatever, and we think to ourselves, oh, it reminds me of what it would feel like to me. But we have no direct internal access to, you know, what, you know, to the internal distress of that other human. It is by extrapolation. Some people like myself, kind of probably extrapolate a bit to their computers. You know, this computer, I feel for my computer, so to speak. And you know, one could argue, but I don't think, you know, it's a bit more subtle, I think, than to just say, you know, this is it's something that applying kind of the sort of the sharp distinctions and the kind of it's going to be simple what's going on ideas that came from sort of the science that from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and so on. The kind of we're going to scienceify it, and it's going to be simple, and we're going to have, you know, really straightforward things to say about it. I don't think it's going to work that way. I think it's a bit more subtle. It's a bit more like the kind of science that has emerged, the emergent science that has emerged, so to speak, from lots of things I've studied about the computational universe and so on. It's not so much of a, we'll say this, this, and this, and then we'll get the conclusion, so to speak. And I
So
think
you
there is
agree that it's almost guaranteed that such emergent properties will occur, but you think it's possible to police such occasions and remove those entities from the system without us risking them copying themselves, backing themselves up somewhere in the system. It seems to me that the internet is just such an extraordinary maze of places where AI gone wrong could back itself up and hide and kind of reemerge.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like viruses do, in viruses, both computer and biological. It's some, the thing is that it's sort of, there's a question, is there some fundamental instability in the system that will cause, something that is a dynamic that we've never seen before, that will sort of suck everything into a black hole and then it's all over type thing? Or is it the case that there are forces at work which are, this could happen, that could happen, and then the counter to that could happen, and then there's more things that could happen. And, the super powerful AI over here gets, and then there are other super powerful AIs over here, and they kind of duke it out, just like biological organisms have done throughout sort of biological history. And it's, to me, I see no evidence of kind of a dramatic sort of instability, very different from what we've seen before. Now, maybe it's sort of interesting to reflect on this. Perhaps the reason that I think that way is because I've spent a large part of my life studying the computational universe and sort of seeing what happens there, and seeing that, yes, there are things that were not intuitive to me that happen there, but you get used to them, you see that they happen, and it's something where I'm not seeing something where it's kind of the black hole is approaching us and it's going to suck us all in type thing. It's
Right.
more that there are phenomena that are complicated, and just like human society has been complicated, just like nature is complicated, there are phenomena, but these phenomena don't seem to end up. See, I think there's a vision of the future that says everything's sucked into a black hole, it all goes in one direction, it's all boring.
Catastrophizing.
But the fact is that, sorry, I didn't catch what you said.
Catastrophizing.
Yes.
We think of the most negative possible outcome, and we focus on that because of our negativity bias.
Well, I think that there's another thing that I would say is more, your sort of let's regulate, let's make the whole world agree on this, that, and the other. To me, that is much more the single black hole sort of, to do that is to make the horrible mistake of playing into the sort of single black hole scenario. The idea that that's the mistake. And when people say, no, AIs are so dangerous, we should all get together and try and figure out, the one world solution, so to speak, that solves it. No, that's the way that you build yourself a black hole, more or less. And
But
I think
presumably, Stephen, Wolfram Research has a massive opportunity to make money here, because you could develop the equivalent of an antivirus software, which would be a sort of AI policing tool for sort of going in and clinically containing and removing such emergent phenomena risks. Is that something that you're working on?
I think that's not a thing that I think that's a sort of philosophically doomed concept.
Oh,
it's
really?
like saying
Why couldn't we develop that kind of policing application?
What is the ground truth? What do you want it to do? In other words, it's like saying, let's clean the internet and put only things that are true on it. It's one of these things that's you have to have a ground truth. You have to decide what it is you're trying to achieve.
Well, the ground truth that I would be looking for, the kind of application that I expected you to suggest, was an application that could come in and clinically extract from the network an AI that had developed emergent properties that could become dangerous?
I find that I mean, that is so kind of, okay.
You
It's
can be
kind of
honest
like,
with me, Stephen. I'm not a specialist, so you can tell me how it is.
no, I think it is sort of interesting for the level of kind of sort of philosophical and scientific kind of, I see how you get to that point, but it is sort of, it's sort of so covered in philosophical and scientific mess
Right.
that I mean, I think that the thing to understand is, it kind of reminds me, long ago there was a science fiction movie called Dark Star, where the premise was these guys were going around the universe blowing up planets that might become unstable at some point, so that nobody would go live there. I think it's kind of this idea that that which might grow into something that we might decide was a thing that was the wrong thing for it to have grown into is, the whole point of computational irreducibility is you can't know what's going to happen. So you can't say, the only way that you can say that you have a system where nothing could ever go wrong is for you not to have a system, so to speak. In
Well,
other
of
words,
course, and I'm not suggesting that nothing should ever go wrong and we shouldn't develop these things. I'm just assuming that there is a massive market for creating a system that can clean up the mess of an AI that goes off track. And I'm assuming that it will be extremely important to have that kind of technology ready for when these systems do start getting powerful, and as you said, the time when we start to have robot systems enacting these military AI systems.
right. I mean, maybe I wonder whether somebody registered ministryoftruth.com and so on. I'm sure they did. I mean, this idea of let's go clean the world up and,
Well, it might be internal. It might be when one of your own AIs go wrong and you want to get it out before it embarrasses you.
Yes. Well, that's what software quality assurance is all about, doing that. It's about testing the things one builds to make sure that they work as one would hope they would work. But, this question of what do you kind of, what do you hope the system is going to do? The is I mean, there's a certain dystopian character to saying, I'm going to have my AI police system go in and zap all the things that are doing things that I don't want, that I think might be going to do the wrong thing, so to speak. I must say that I have a very negative visceral reaction to that concept. I think,
Stephen, just because we've got to say goodbye, because you've got to go to your next meeting, but just to confirm, so the listeners are absolutely clear on where you stand on this, you're suggesting a non-interventionist approach to any future AI systems, particularly the military ones, the robotic and drone swarm technologies that are currently being developed behind closed doors. You're saying we should have no intervention approach to any potentially dangerous emergent phenomena that we haven't predicted.
What does intervention mean? I mean, intervention means the government?
Well, anybody, whether it's the private company developing it, whether it's the government that's commissioned it, whether it's the international community trying to make sure that we don't start any nuclear wars over some mistakes made by our technology. I mean, I'm not talking about a new world order and a single world government. I'm just talking about safety. I just want to be clear before we close, because I know you've got to go. What are you suggesting? You're suggesting we shouldn't raise a single finger to protect ourselves from...
We should try and be sensible, right? Don't, but the idea of a sort of a major sort of global obsession, I think, is wrong. Yeah. The fact, people will do things where I say, oh, I'm going to get the AI to do this or that. And it's like, that's obviously stupid. You obviously shouldn't do that.
But they're obviously going to do it anyway. We've got to have something up our sleeve for when
Well,
somebody does that, a terrorist group or, you know, a government or...
Yes, but the problem is, you know, having the big net, the big hammer is not, it's not realistic, and it's not the right idea. You know, there are specific things, you know, if you don't want to have, you know, face recognition surveillance or something, then outlaw face recognition surveillance. Or, you know, outlaw the ability to use that for evidence for this or that thing. Those are controls that you can actually, you know, enact. Saying in some vague way, you know, we don't want powerful AIs to exist is, you know, it's both meaningless and pointless. I mean, I think the thing that I think is worth understanding about governments is that in some sense, a government is a bit like an AI. It's this big system that has certain rules that it operates by, and it sort of does its thing, and it grinds along, and, you know, it's a machine, so to speak. And, you know, if you say, well, I'm going to have that machine control this other machine, that, you know, it doesn't really, it's, to me, it's not that's not the place to go. Now to say there are specific
Is there a
things
place
like,
we should go? Is there, just to close to you, because I've got to let you go now. Is there a place we should go? What do you suggest?
well, there are, you know, there are specific sort of things where, should you connect an AI to this, you know, autonomous, you know, this car that's driving in this way? Well, be sensible. Don't do, you know, don't do something which is, you know, which is not, don't do something on that local scale that doesn't make sense. But a global overarching, you know, AI is bad, let's shut it all down,
Take that
doesn't make sense
example,
to me.
quickly, Stephen, take that same example and apply it to a military drone swarm system.
It's a complicated one. I mean, the question of what, you know,
They're
is there
definitely going
going
to
to,
do it. They're definitely
well,
going to do it.
of course.
So what do we do
I
when
mean,
that goes wrong? What do you suggest we do in that
I mean,
case?
you know, this is the complicated thing, you know. You know, things like the Geneva Convention seem to have been fairly successful. You know, things, this is complicated. And I think it's, you know, the kind of a sort of the heavy hammer of saying, you know, don't connect a, you know, don't, you know, connect a powerful weapon to a system that, I mean, for years, there's been sort of proto-AI in weapon systems. The question of whether, you know, at what point the chain from, I mean, the AI is, even in the systems that are imagined right now, the AI is not going to decide whether to go to war. Somebody decided to do that. And the AI was at some point in the chain automating the process of deciding whether to shoot the gun in this direction or in that direction. And it's, you know, the question of what, you know, where in that chain you should say, you should try to inject humans is an interesting question. I think the way to think about these things, and I have not thought about this one in as much, in much detail, but I think, you know, legal systems and international treaties and so on have certain levers that they can operate. Like, you can be, it's a question, are you responsible? Do you just say, oh, my drone was the thing that blew that up, I wasn't responsible for it, it was just an AI? Probably the system should not be set up so that you can get away with saying that. But, you know, that's an example of how you start reeling things in a way that can actually work, rather than saying, let's, you know, expect the technology or some mysterious constraint on the technology to be the thing that solves it. I mean, it's like, don't use your drone to blow up my thing and then just throw up your hands and say it was just my drone what did it, because somebody else is going to do the same thing to you. And, you know, eventually you'll decide, no, let's have an agreement that we're actually responsible for what our drones do, or whatever it is. You know, I think that's the type of approach. And yes, it is less like somebody just writes a, you know, a one paragraph sort of international law that says something that says AIs will never do the wrong thing. And everybody says, yes, you've done a brilliant thing. That's just silly. I think these things that are actually realistic, they take more thought, and
Absolutely.
that thought has not, in my opinion, been happening as much as it should have been, because there has been a certain tendency to go to either be very sort of technical scientific, which won't work, or to be very sort of pure ideological, which I think also won't work. I think what's needed is what happened 400 years ago or so, which was people actually thought about things like political philosophy in a carefully reasoned way and came up with things that, well, gave us, for example, modern democracy, which lots of people seem to like. And so I think that's the kind of thing that's needed. And as you say,
Stephen Wolfram, thank you so much for going into the detail at the end there, and I'm very grateful you let me pin you down just to try and get a clear suggestion on the right path here. So, Stephen Wolfram, thank you very much for your time.
Sure.